And it's going to be repeated quite a bit throughout the lesson. In fact, it may be to the point where you're going to say, all right already, we've got the point. But I will be stressing this. And the two statements in our book, which pretty much tells what we're going to be talking about, are page 55, the purpose. And that is to see our role in carrying out the purpose of God. And the second one is the key verse on page 56. Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today. Then there's a couple of quotes on the board that substantiate this, and that is, God is ready to bring purpose out of everything that happens. And again, I'll be repeating this to the point. You're going to say, I know. And I found this quote that I liked. Adversity is the first path to truth. Lord Byron, which I'm sure must be the poet. Today's scripture is the last in the book of Genesis. It's Genesis 50, 15 to 26. And these verses sort of serve as a bridge to the next stage of Israel's story. And going over in them as we find it in Exodus. So this more or less takes us from one story to the next. Last week's lesson and this week's lesson sort of goes together. So let's just sort of recall what happened last week. We just listened as Joseph revealed his identity and forgave his brothers. Now, understand, he forgave them, but he didn't actually say the word. And we're going to talk about that later. But he did say to them, do not be angry with yourselves, because God sent me before you to preserve life. Well, how did he preserve life? Two ways. One is that he helped the Egyptians through the 7-year famine. And the next was he was instrumental in preserving the life of the descendants of Abraham. And you also recall last week that Joseph was waiting for Jacob and the rest of the family to come to Egypt. And he was so excited because he was at last going to see his son Joseph, who he had not seen for years. And many of you maybe remember from the Bible when Jacob came to Egypt, he settled in the land of Goshen. And he said, after I die, and he lived for 17 years, Jacob said, bury me in the area where my ancestors are. And that is, he wanted to be with his matriarchs and the patriarchs, such as Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and Rebekah, and so forth. Now we have to remember that the Hebrew people were tent dwellers, so they moved around a lot. And for them they were very particular about where they were going to be buried. In fact, he said, bury me in this area. I can't tell you for sure exactly, but it's in Canaan. And he said, and again, the reason this was important to these nomadic people was they were moving around a lot, but they wanted a place where they could periodically visit these graves, and they also wanted them close enough so they could see that the graves weren't desecrated or looted. So this was very important to someone that moved around. And Joseph then, in turn, when Jacob said, this is where I want to be buried, Joseph said, bury me when I die, bury me here in Egypt. But when God comes to you, to the Hebrews, to go to the promised land, please take my bones and bury me in the promised land. And Moses honored that request. And so Joseph then was buried, his bones, at Shechem, up in this area. So this was all very important to these people. Let's go on then with our lesson today. And find out the rest of the story. Cliff, would you read our scripture 15 through 26?
Realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did to him?" So they approached Joseph, saying, "Your father gave us this instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong they did in harming you. Now therefore, please forgive the crime of the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also wept, fell down before him and said, "We are here as your slaves." But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide you and your little ones." In this way he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation, the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, who were also born on Joseph's knees. Then Joseph said to his brother, "I am about to die, but God will surely come to you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abram, to Isaac, and to Jacob." So Joseph made the Israelites swear, saying, "When God comes to you, you shall carry my bones up from here." And Joseph died, being 110 years old. He was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt.
And again, the theme of this is God's ability to bring good out of evil, to bring purpose to everything that happens. And the author said that God's purpose often rests in our human hands. In other words, we are to carry this out. Can you think of some examples how we could carry out the purpose of God, bringing good out of evil? I might cite one example, and you might think of something after that. I thought about World War II, which is certainly when you think of evil and something bad. And I thought of one, there are many good things that come from that. Not that you wanted that for this purpose, but I thought of when they say that before the war, 6% of the population had a college degree. Then came the GI Bill of Rights. And after that, 20% of the population had college degrees, and this strengthened our middle class. Now that was just something I thought of. Can you think of something that maybe was evil, but from that, God's purpose was served?
A lot of the new surgical and medicine techniques came out from World War II.
Good. Yeah. Would that be like penicillin?
Yes.
Right.
Well, I remember one time I stole a kiss, and that was bad. And then I realized what I'd done, so I gave it right back, and that was good.
This all fits in God's purpose. Yes, Jane?
Well, I wonder if the civil rights movement would have advanced as much if Martin Luther King hadn't died a martyr's death, because we know so much more about it.
Right.
Really is.
Good example. Good example. It isn't that we want evil to happen, but if it does happen, and it will, because we're in an imperfect world, what can we glean from that? Yes?
When we were in London and visited one church that the Germans had burned out, completely burned out, the only thing that was standing was the cross. And when you look in the contributors to rebuild that church, the German government was the biggest contributor to rebuild that church years later. And as a sad thing to have had happen, that's the way it was. And the cross is that was still standing is in this shape. They were selling lots of things there at that little jewelry store. But yeah, it was quite moving for me.
It would be. And I'm
The
sure,
reason they burned the church is they used it as a reference point to make their bombing runs on the nearby factories. And they bombed the church, set fire to the church so they could have a reference point for the bombing.
thank you for sharing that. Didn't, yes,
You're mentioning World War II, it makes me think of the atomic bomb. Now, we're using that technology, nuclear energy, to generate electricity.
there's just lots of examples, aren't
Yeah.
there? Just lots of them. Yes.
I seem to always go back to my experience in Central America, but I think it's twofold, the evil that human beings are able to put on others. And sometimes even within the Christian church, some unhappy things can happen. But I think the good that comes from that it has a tendency to wake up some of us that are pretty apathetic. And the good that can come out of that, the good that came out of those 3 or 4 countries that were at war just trying to find justice, is that it drew so many more people in, opened up eyes, brought people together that were able to reconcile those that were in conflict and bring some peace. It's not perfect, but I think when we see evil happening, that our challenge is to see what I need to learn about it, who can I join to change this, to make the good come from that.
Good point. The New Interpreter's Bible says that God does not have a highly detailed plan all worked out, and that it will come to fruition no matter what we do. Of course, God will persevere no matter what happens, and humans do complicate His divine planning. But we have to remember that God's way will not be stymied. And again, God's plan is to bring the evil devised by us to good effect. Even Paul said in Romans 8:28, in everything and even the worst that evildoers may throw God's way, God will draw it into the divine plan for good. And as I was studying for this and reading this, this all seemed to strengthen my faith. That no matter what we do, God's plan will persevere. Any comments? Let's go back and revisit our scriptures. After Jacob died, the brothers imagined the worst for themselves. They thought, uh-oh, our father is gone now. Is this going to be, will Joseph retaliate? And of course, they were so afraid they even lied and said, Dad says be sure and forgive us. So, what do you think this shows about the brothers' faith, about their character? Wasn't good, was it? But what about Joseph's faith and his character?
He was compassionate.
It seems to me that the fear that they showed brings forth that they recognize they're wrong. Otherwise, they would not have probably felt fear. So maybe there was growth there.
You would hope so.
Joseph obviously is bigger than most of us to forgive that.
And I think Joseph saw the big picture.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say.
Yeah.
I think he had a relationship with God, because he'd been imprisoned, and then he became the top person for Pharaoh.
Right. Bob?
Yeah, Do you remember John Wesley? Okay, you remember the American colony. John Wesley lived during the latter part of his life during the American Revolutionary War. He was against the American Revolution. He thought it was dangerous, thought it was silly, and just couldn't quite understand it. He thought the Americans were making a tremendous mistake by trying to separate from Britain. But after the war, it was he who said, well, he already had Methodist movements going on in the American colonies to a certain extent. But after the war, he said, well, the Americans won their independence. I don't want to separate myself from them. I want them to be close to the church and everything. So he sent two leaders, Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury. And in 1784, in the city of Baltimore, I think, or was it Philadelphia, I'm not quite sure. Anyway, the Methodist Church was formed. And anyway, the first religious group that went to the new president, George Washington, to pledge their loyalty to the new president and to the new country, were four Methodist leaders. So John Wesley reconciled with his American friends. So, I don't know, that's just one of the tidbits of history which
Good example, thank you, Bob.
warms our heart.
And you know, I thought about that, going back to these brothers of Joseph, they didn't trust him, did they? And maybe they didn't trust him because they weren't trustworthy themselves. You know, you can't trust unless you yourself are trustworthy. And that sort of fit them.
Joseph was tested during his time in Egypt, and it made him stronger,
It did, didn't it?
and they weren't.
Exactly. A little adversity. A little adversity. Notice that we do not hear the word forgive out of Joseph's mouth. Now he said, do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? I myself will provide for you and your little ones. What he was doing was restoring the dignity of those brothers. When you say, I forgive, you're kind of saying, you know, I'm good and you're not. He wanted to put them on an equal level. And I thought it was interesting that the author was talking about this because it boils down to this. He was helping them save face. And to say forgive, of course, is appropriate in a general way. But it does give sort of a hierarchical thing. This puts me above you. And I thought once, this was many years ago, I was taking a class at University of Northern Iowa, and another teacher was writing with me, and she was going on about how there was a teacher's meeting and the principal was talking, and she said, I pointed out his mistakes. I really told him. I didn't say anything, but I thought, was that the time or place? How must he have felt? Did that take away his dignity? Did that take away his respect? This was her immediate supervisor. Of course, I didn't say anything, but there's, you know, things to think that way. It's important that we make sure our fellow man has his self-respect. Do you believe that? Because if they have their self-respect, they might act differently, mightn't they? Toward you, toward others. It's very important. I think how much better job we did after World War II in restoring those countries back to where they should be. Didn't do a very good job in World War I, as we know through the Versailles Treaty. But this is very, very important. Then we come to verse 17, where Joseph wept and the brothers wept. Now, there's no biblical historians to say, why did they cry? And I don't want to sound over dramatic. I don't want to look as though I'm trying to write a script for a soap opera. But I'm thinking, what were they crying about? Why was Joseph crying? Why were the brothers crying?
The Spirit of the Lord had descended upon them.
They cried. Okay, that's good.
It was a tense situation for all of them.
Good, tense. It was suggested that perhaps Joseph was crying because he thought, did I really reassure my father, Jacob, that yes, I was going to treat these scoundrels well? You know, you think he could have been that? Or maybe he saw through these brothers and realized what worthless twerps they could be. And then, of course, the brothers were crying, no doubt because could have been relief. Oh, he's not going to pull the plug on us. You know, we're saved even though we lied, cheated, whatever they did.
You know, it seems hard to believe, but he might have actually loved them.
Good point. Yeah.
I think tears of joy, you know, here's his family back. I have my family.
They're not perfect.
No, yeah. Our families are not perfect. That would include me, I guess.
And we are moved to tears. I remember 2 or 3 times yesterday at the retreat, I was moved to tears.
I was too.
And sometimes even in our church service, I am. So there could be many reasons, you know, make up whatever you want. But the thing is, God is ready to bring purpose out of everything that happens. The teacher's manual suggested using instances from our church history or maybe a personal experience to show how this is true. One suggestion was to invite someone over 90 and to share their insights about their living faithfully and carrying out God's purpose. I have a friend in Iowa Falls, Don Barker, who is 100 this month. So I wrote to him, and here's a picture of him when he was younger. And I wrote to him and I said, Don, could you share your belief for our class in the 100 years? And bless his heart, it didn't take too many days, and he wrote this letter, 2-page letter. And it's written quite well and quite concise, and it's a beautiful insight to his faith. But for clarity's sake, Cliff typed it out, and I will pass this out because I thought when you get home, you might like to read about the faith of a 100-year-old man. He did a fine job, and I'll pass those out. In fact, he's 100, his wife is 97, and it was only 2 years ago that they moved into assisted living. He doesn't hear well, and she doesn't see well, but we got a beautiful Christmas letter from them this year, so they're doing very, very well. But I thought it was interesting to show that.
Pat, we had lunch with a 93-year-old last week, and he's Catholic and has been all of his life, and of course we're Methodist, so we were talking. Well, before we even had lunch, he ordered for me. I thought that was so cute. We went to the restaurant, and he said, now, little lady, what is it that you like to eat? And so I said, well, this right here kind of is pretty good. And so when the waitress came, he said, and the little lady will have. So that was cute. But when we got our food, I looked at Dawn, and I said, would you like to say thanks? Give grace? And Dawn said, yes. And so Clarence, the different Clarence, and the Clarence stuck out his hands. And when Dawn finished, very brief, but he finished the grace, Clarence had tears in his eyes, and he was so touched that we would have grace.
Oh, that was nice.
And I thought just that much was a testimony to his faith.
Exactly. Exactly. Of course, and another thing they said, think about your church history. How did events and experiences seem negative at the time, but gave way to God's bigger plan? Now, the office ran off for us the history of our church, 1876 through 2010. And they ran off enough of them that each family unit can have one. If there's not enough, I'll see that you get it. But it's sort of an ongoing history. And Larry said, would you tell the class that if they have any comments or suggestions, write it in there and hand it to them, because as I said, it's sort of an ongoing progress. But there's some interesting pictures in there and the story of our history. You probably already know a little bit about the story. That old Calvary that was at Lulu and English Streets was having a hard time. In fact, by the time of their centennial 1876 to 1976. It's very interesting, this book, because there's interesting pictures, there's some word names there that you'll recognize. And even then, in 1976, they realized that they were having problems. There's a picture of the first church, there's a second one, and they had even built a 3-story educational building, thinking this would help to strengthen their church, because things weren't good. They were becoming older, not getting young new people. And finally, they hired a consultant to come in. And he said, why don't you just die comfortably? In other words, just stay there until you peacefully expire. Well, the church prayed about what to do next, and a district superintendent came along and suggested that there was some land up there in North Rock Road. Now remember, in 1976, this was in the boonies. I'm not sure it was even paved. Was it, Jen?
It was paved, but it was a single, just the,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
single lanes.
But ground was broken in August 1981, and about half of the congregation came. And we've got to remember, this was an elderly congregation. So you can see why maybe they didn't come here. But Janice Tucker, with her parents, took the leap of faith and made that long drive to attend Calvary on Rock Road. And so I've asked Janet to share the history, and also maybe Ann has something to say because she was directly or indirectly involved with the church on Lulu.
Just my children.
Okay. Janet, I'll give you the floor.